I knew my children were planning my funeral when I found a handwritten list dividing my belongings between them. I was still alive, still paying my electricity bill, still making my own breakfast, still watering the geraniums on my balcony every morning. And yet there, on my kitchen table, was a list written in my daughter's handwriting. The house, Daniel. The jewelry, Sophie. The car, Daniel. The savings account, divided equally. Mother's bedroom furniture, Sophie. At the bottom, beneath everything else, someone had written, "For anything remaining, sell it." I stood there holding a cup of tea, staring at those words until the tea went cold. My name is Margaret Miller. I was 69 when I found that list, and until that morning, I believed I knew my children. I had two. Daniel was 42. Sophie was 38. They were not bad children. At least, that was what I had told myself. For years, Daniel was practical, ambitious, and always in a hurry. Sophie was more emotional, more charming, and somehow always had a crisis that required my help. Their father, Robert, had died 11 years earlier. After his death, I raised them both alone. I never remarried. The three of us became a small family. For years, I believed that was enough. Apparently, I was wrong. I picked up the list. The paper trembled slightly in my hand, not because I was weak, because I was angry. There was something humiliating. There was something humiliating about seeing your life reduced to objects. The house where I had raised them had become a line on a page. The wedding ring Robert had given me had become an item under jewelry. My car was no longer the vehicle that took me to doctor's appointments and grocery stores. It was simply something Daniel wanted, and my savings were already divided. While I was still alive, I sat down slowly. For several minutes I didn't move. Then I heard the front door open. My daughter walked into the house. "Mom?" I quickly folded the paper. Sophie appeared in the hallway, carrying 2 shopping bags. She smiled. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" I looked at her. "I'm not." She put the bags on the counter. "I brought you some groceries." "How thoughtful." She smiled again. Then she walked toward me. "Are you okay?" I almost asked her. I almost held up the list and said, "Who wrote this?" But something stopped me. Not fear. Something more useful. Curiosity. I wanted to know how much my children had already decided about my life. So I simply smiled. "I'm fine." Sophie kissed my cheek. "Good." Then she opened the refrigerator. "You really need to get more vegetables." I watched her move around my kitchen. The same kitchen where she had done her homework as a child. Some cried beautifully. The same kitchen where she had cried after her first breakup. The same kitchen where I had cooked Christmas dinner for her family. And suddenly I wondered how long she had been looking at this house and seeing only its value. Not memories, not home. Valued. That afternoon, after Sophie left, I unfolded the paper again. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the bottom was a date 6 months in the future, and beside it was a note. Need to have everything sorted before then. I stared at the words. What was happening 6 months from now? I had no idea, but I knew one thing. I was going to find out. My husband used to say that children don't stop needing their parents when they grow up. They simply learn to ask for different things. When Daniel was 10, he needed bicycle repairs. When he was 20, he needed university tuition. When he was 30, he needed help with the deposit for his first house. Sophie was different. She didn't ask for large things. She asked for small things constantly. Could I watch the grandchildren? Could I lend her money until payday? Could I help with a credit card payment? Could I look after her dog? Could I sign something? Could I give her a little more time? Individually, none of these requests seemed important. Together, they became a lifetime pattern. I never complained. That was partly my fault. I thought helping my children was simply what mothers did. After Robert died, I became even more protective. I remember Daniel standing beside me at the funeral. He was 31. He held my hand and said, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of you." I believed him. Sophie hugged me and cried against my shoulder. "We'll always be here." I believed her too. Maybe that's why the list hurt so much. It wasn't about money. It was about discovering that the promises I had treasured meant something different to them. The next morning, Daniel called. "Mom, how are you?" "Fine. Sophie come by yesterday?" "Yes." "What did she say?" I paused. "About what?" There was a brief silence. "Nothing." I smiled to myself, interesting. "Why did you ask?" "No reason." Then he changed the subject. "Have you thought about moving?" I looked through the kitchen window. "Moving where?" "Somewhere smaller." "Why?" "Well," he hesitated. "This house is a lot for you now." I laughed quietly. "I'm 69, Daniel, not 99. I know. I manage perfectly well. I'm just thinking about you." "That's kind." Another pause. Then he said, "If you sold the house, you'd have enough money to live comfortably for years." I stared at the wall. There it was, the first crack. "I already have enough money." "Not forever. I have no plans to die tomorrow." He laughed awkwardly. "Mom." "What? I'm just saying you should think about the future." "I am." "Good." We ended the call. I sat quietly. Then I opened the drawer beside my desk. Inside was the folder containing my will. It was old, very old. I had written it shortly after Robert died. Everything was divided equally between Daniel and Sophie, the house, the savings, the investments. Everything. I had never told them the details. I had always thought that was private. Now I wondered if they had somehow learned about it. I called my solicitor. "Mr. Harris." "Yes, Margaret. I need to make an appointment. Is everything okay?" "Yes." I looked at the list sitting on my kitchen table. "I just think it's time I reviewed my will." There was a pause. "Of course. Soon." "How about Thursday?" "That works." When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: control. It was small, but it was there, and I needed it. Because if my children had already divided my belongings while I was alive, had a feeling they were expecting me to behave like someone who had no say in what happened next, they were about to discover that I did. 3 days later, I went to Daniel's house for Sunday lunch. His wife, Rachel, greeted me at the door. "Mom, you look wonderful." "Thank you." The grandchildren ran toward me. I hugged both of them. For an hour, everything felt normal. Too normal. Then, while Rachel was putting dessert on the table, I heard voices from the hallway. Daniel. And Sophie. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard my name. I stood still. "She's not going to agree," Sophie said. Daniel answered quietly. "She doesn't need to agree." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" Sophie asked. "She's getting older." There was silence then. "We just need to make sure everything is settled before something happens." I stepped backward. I didn't want them to know I was listening. Sophie spoke again. "What about the house? I'm handling that. And Mom's accounts?" "I'm trying to get the information." I felt my stomach tighten. "What information?" Sophie asked. "The investment accounts. Does she have them?" "Yes." "How much?" "I don't know exactly." I heard Sophie sigh. "Then find out." I backed away from the hallway. I walked into the kitchen. Rachel looked at me. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "Perfect, but it wasn't. Not anymore." When I drove home that evening, I didn't cry. I didn't call either of my children. I didn't confront them. Instead, I made a list, not of what they would inherit, of what they thought they were entitled to: the house, the savings, the car, the jewelry, the furniture. And then I added one more line: their expectations. I put the list beside theirs. Then I made myself a cup of tea. For the first time in my life, I began preparing for my own future without asking what my children wanted. And that was when I discovered something that made the entire situation much worse. My house was worth far more than I had ever told them. Much more. And I realized that if Daniel and Sophie knew the real value of what they were dividing, they hadn't simply been guessing. Someone had been giving them information. Someone who had access to my private financial records. Someone close enough to know exactly what I owned. Someone I trusted. I just didn't know who. Yet the first person I suspected was my solicitor. Then I felt ashamed of myself. Mr. Harris had handled my affairs for more than 20 years. He had helped Robert and me buy the house. He had prepared our wills. He had helped me settle Robert's estate after his death. If I couldn't trust him, who could I trust? So I decided not to accuse anyone. I simply started checking. The next morning, I went through every document in my filing cabinet: bank statements, investment reports, insurance policies, property papers, tax documents. Everything was there, except one thing: The most recent valuation of my house was missing. I knew I had received it 6 months earlier. I remembered placing it in the blue folder, but the folder was empty. I called the estate agent who had arranged the valuation. "Could you send me another copy?" "Of course, Mrs. Miller." She paused. "Actually, that's unusual." "What is?" "The valuation was requested by your daughter." I stopped breathing for a moment. "Which daughter?" "Sophie." "Did I authorize that?" "She told us you had." I thanked her and ended the call. I sat quietly at my desk. Sophie had obtained a valuation of my home without telling me, but that still didn't prove anything. Maybe she had been trying to help. Maybe she'd been organizing my affairs because she was worried about me. I wanted to believe that. Then my phone rang. It was Mr. Harris. "Margaret, I reviewed your file, and there was an unusual request 6 months ago." "What kind of request?" "Someone asked for a copy of your estate planning documents." "Who?" He hesitated. "Your son, Daniel." I closed my eyes. "Did you give them to him?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I told him he had no authorization." I exhaled. At least one person had respected my privacy. Did he say why he wanted them? Some beguiled beautifully. He said you were becoming forgetful and that he needed to understand what would happen to the property. I almost laughed. Forgetful. That was convenient. I was 69, still working part-time as a bookkeeper for a local charity, still driving, cooking, managing my finances, and living independently. Apparently, that was enough for my son to begin planning around me. Then Mr. Harris said something that made me sit upright. "Margaret, there was another request." "When?" "About 3 weeks ago." "What request?" "Your daughter asked whether the house had any restrictions preventing a sale." I stared at the wall. "Did you tell her?" "No, thank you." I hung up. For a long time I didn't move. Then I looked around my living room. The old sofa, Robert's bookcase. The piano Sophie had learned to play on when she was 9. The wooden dining table where Daniel had once built model airplanes. Every object suddenly seemed to have a shadow behind it. They weren't remembering my life. They were calculating it, and I knew I had to stop reacting emotionally. So I did something neither of them expected. I changed nothing, not yet. I didn't sell the house. I didn't change the locks. I didn't confront them. I simply watched, and within 2 weeks I saw more than I had seen in the previous 10 years. Sophie began visiting more often. She started offering to organize things. "Mom, you really should sort these drawers." "Mom, do you still need all these books?" "Mom, why are you keeping all this furniture?" At first, I smiled. Then I started noticing what she was really doing. She was measuring, not with a ruler, with her eyes. She looked at the antique cabinet in the hallway and asked how old it was. She examined Robert's watch. She asked where I kept my jewelry. One afternoon, she stood in front of the painting above the fireplace. "How much do you think that's worth?" "I don't know." Have you ever had it appraised? No, she smiled. You should. I looked at her. Why? Just curious. She moved on. 2 days later, Daniel came over. He walked through the house as if he were already responsible for it. The wall could come down, he said. What? In the kitchen. Why? To open up the space. I laughed. You're renovating my house now. He smiled. I'm just thinking about possibilities. I watched him touch the old wooden frame around the doorway. Then he asked, Mom, where are the property papers? My office. Why? I like knowing where things are. He looked at me strangely. I smiled. Something wrong? No. But he seemed disappointed. That evening, I understood something. They were waiting for me to weaken. Perhaps not physically. Psychologically. They wanted me to believe I was old. Confused. Unable to manage my own affairs. They wanted me to hand over control voluntarily. So I decided to give them exactly what they expected. I started acting uncertain. I told Sophie I was having trouble remembering passwords. I told Daniel I didn't understand some banking statements. I even complained about being tired. Within days, their behavior changed. They became more confident. They spoke over me. They made suggestions without asking. Daniel started saying, We'll take care of that. Sophie said, When the time comes, we'll handle everything. Phrase, when the time comes, began appearing constantly. I let them believe I was babysitting, but privately, I was organizing every document, every account, every asset, every password, every insurance policy. I made copies. I moved important records to a secure location. And most importantly, I discovered where the information had been coming from. It wasn't my solicitor. It wasn't my bank. It wasn't an accidental leak. Someone inside my family. Someone I had never suspected. My husband had opened a small investment account shortly before he died. It wasn't large. Some cried beautifully. Over the years, I had simply left it alone. The dividends accumulated. I rarely touched it because I didn't need the money. According to the latest statement, it was worth just under $240,000. I had never told Daniel or Sophie about it. But the strange thing was, 6 months earlier, someone had requested information about that account. Not me. A third party. I called the investment company. The woman on the phone was careful. I can't release confidential details, Mrs. Miller. I understand, but I can tell you whether there was an attempted change. My heart started beating faster. There was, yes. What kind? Someone attempted to add an authorized representative. Who? She couldn't tell me immediately. But after verifying my identity, she said, the request came from an email address associated with Daniel Miller. I put the phone down. There was no confusion anymore. Daniel had tried to gain access to my investment account, and Sophie had been collecting property information. They had divided my belongings before I was dead because they believed they would soon control everything. But why? What had changed 6 months ago? Searched through my calendar. Nothing. Then I saw it, a medical appointment, a routine checkup. 6 months earlier, my doctor had told me that my blood pressure was higher than usual. Nothing serious, no diagnosis, nothing that suggested I was dying. But apparently, my children had heard about the appointment. Perhaps someone had exaggerated it. Perhaps someone had told them I was sick. Maybe that was when they decided their waiting had ended. I called Daniel. "Hi, Mom. I need to ask you something." "Sure. Have you ever tried to access my investment account?" Silence. Just long enough. Then, "What account?" I smiled sadly. "You know exactly what account." "I don't." "Daniel." "I swear." I listened to his breathing. Then I said, "I know about the request." He stopped talking. "Mom, I was just trying to understand your finances." "Why?" "Because you need help." "I didn't ask for help." "You don't always know when you need help." Sentence chilled me. Not because of what it meant, because of how certain he sounded. "Who told you I couldn't manage my finances?" "No one." "Then why did you try to access them?" He didn't answer. Finally, I said, "Never do it again." He became defensive. "You're making a big deal out of this." "I think it's a very big deal. You're being paranoid." I laughed quietly. "Maybe." Then I hung up. That was the moment I stopped, hoping this was a misunderstanding. My children, knew exactly what they were doing. And now I knew exactly what I had to do. The following Monday, I met with my solicitor. I brought everything: the list, the property records, the attempted account access, the estate agency request, the messages, the notes I had made. He read everything without interrupting. When he finished, he looked at me. "Margaret, what do you want?" I thought about it. For years, I would have answered, "I want my children to be happy." This time I said, "I want control of my own life." He smiled. "Good answer." We discussed my legal options. I could change my will. I could restructure my assets. I could place certain property into a protected trust. I could make it clear that no one would receive anything, simply because they expected it. But I didn't want to punish my children out of anger. That would have been too easy. I wanted them to understand something. Inheritance is a gift. Tas, not a salary, not a reward for being my child, not something they could divide while I was still breathing. So I made a decision. I would not disinherit them. I would simply stop allowing them to treat my life like an estate waiting to be liquidated. My house would remain mine. My investments would remain under my control. My personal belongings would go where I chose. And, most importantly, I created a separate fund for each grandchild. Money that Daniel and Sophie could not control. Money that would be released only under carefully defined conditions. My solicitor looked at the documents. "Are you certain?" "Yes." "And your children?" "They can have what I choose to give them." And if they become angry? I smiled. They've already decided what belongs to them. I looked down at the new estate documents. Now they can be disappointed by the truth. There was one final step. I needed them to know. Not everything, just enough. I invited Daniel and Sophie to dinner. Both arrived on time. Both looked nervous. That pleased me more than it should have. We sat around the dining table, the same table where I had celebrated birthdays with them, the same table where they had once argued over the last piece of cake. Sophie smiled. "Mom, why did you want us both here?" "I wanted to talk about something important." Daniel looked at her, then back at me. "Is something wrong?" "No." I poured myself some water. "I've updated my estate plan." They both became very still. Sophie spoke first. "Why?" "Because I'm entitled to." Daniel shifted in his chair. "Are you changing everything?" "Yes." Silence. I looked at both of them. "I know about the list." Neither moved. "What list?" Daniel asked. I smiled. "The list dividing my belongings." Sophie went pale. Daniel stared at the table. I continued. "I know about the house." Silence. "The jewelry." Still silence. "The car." Sophie looked at me. "Mom, and the savings." Daniel finally spoke. "Who told you?" I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. "You didn't even ask whether it was true." Neither answered. I reached into a folder and placed a copy of their list on the table. Sophie stared at her own handwriting. Daniel looked at her, then at me. "I can explain," she whispered. "No." I shook my head. "You don't need to explain why you wanted things." I looked at both of them. "You need to explain why you thought I was already dead." Sophie began crying. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom, that's not fair." "Fair?" I looked at him. "You tried to access my investment account." Face changed. "You checked?" "Yes." "I was worried about you." "No." My voice remained calm. "You were worried about what would happen to your inheritance." Daniel looked away. Sophie whispered, "We thought you were getting sick." "I had high blood pressure." "You weren't yourself." "I was myself." She cried harder. "We were scared." I nodded. "Were you scared for me?" She couldn't answer. "Or scared you'd lose what you expected to receive?" The room became silent. Finally, Daniel said, "We made a mistake." "No." Shook my head. "A mistake is forgetting someone's birthday." I looked at the list between us. This was a plan. Neither argued. And strangely, that was the moment I felt free, because I no longer needed them to admit it. I knew. They knew. That was enough. I handed each of them an envelope. Daniel opened his. Sophie opened hers. Inside was a copy of my new estate instructions. Their faces changed as they read. The house wasn't being divided. It wasn't being sold automatically. My investments weren't being split according to their old calculations. And the jewelry? I had already decided where most of it would go. Robert's watch would go to my grandson. My wedding ring would go to my granddaughter when she turned 25. The furniture would remain in the house. And my savings? Most would be placed into charitable and family trusts. Daniel looked up. You're giving away the money? Some of it. How much? Enough. He looked angry. That isn't fair. I smiled. Neither was dividing my life while I was still living it. Sophie covered her mouth. Mom, please. I looked at her. I am not taking everything from you. That seemed to surprise her. You're still my children, I continued. But being my child doesn't mean you own me. Daniel stared at the documents. What do we get? I looked at him. That question is exactly why we're here. He said nothing. I continued. You will both receive an inheritance. His face relaxed slightly, but only after my death. Sophie looked at me. And before that, nothing unless I choose to give it. The room became silent again. I folded my hands. You wanted to know what belonged to you. I smiled. Nothing belongs to you yet. I expected anger. I expected distance. I expected accusations. And I got all three. For several months, Daniel barely spoke to me. Sophie called less often. There were relatives who told me I had been too harsh. One cousin said, "They're your children. You should forgive them," I said. I have forgiven them. She looked confused. Then why aren't you giving them what they want? Because forgiveness doesn't require surrender. That sentence stayed with me. Something changed after that. Not immediately, slowly. Daniel eventually called, not to ask about money. He asked if I wanted to have coffee. I agreed. We sat in a small cafe near my house. He looked older, tired. I was wrong, he said. I didn't answer. I thought you were becoming weaker. I looked at him. And I was becoming worse. That was as honest. He told me he'd been under pressure. His business wasn't doing well. He had debts. He was afraid. And somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing me as his mother and started seeing me as the solution to his financial problems. I listened. When he finished, I said, I understand why you were afraid. He looked relieved. Then I added, but understanding you doesn't mean I excuse you. He nodded. I know. That was the first real conversation we'd had in years. Sophie took longer. When she finally came to see me, she brought an old photograph. It was from Christmas when she was 12. She was sitting on my lap. Robert was standing behind us. I almost cried when I saw it. I found this, she said. I remember that day. So do I. She looked down. I don't know when everything changed. I knew what she meant. Neither did I. Maybe it had happened slowly. Maybe it was pressure. Maybe it was greed. Maybe it was simply the mistake of assuming that parents exist to provide forever. But I knew one thing. I couldn't change what had happened. I could only decide what happened next. I reached across the table. She took my hand. For the first time in nearly a year, felt like I was holding my daughter again, not an heir, not a beneficiary, my daughter, and that distinction mattered. I still live in the same house. The kitchen is old. The floors make noise at night. The upstairs bathroom needs repairs, and Robert's books are still on the shelf. I could sell it. The estate agent tells me I'd make a considerable amount, but I don't want to. Not because of money, because this house is not an asset waiting for someone else. It is the place where my life happened, the place where my children grew up, the place where my husband kissed me for the last time before entering the hospital, the place where I learned to be alone, the place where I learned that being alone doesn't mean being powerless. The list my children wrote is still in my possession. I keep it in a drawer, not as evidence, as a reminder, because sometimes we don't discover who people are through what they say. We discover it through what they think they can take when they believe we aren't looking. My children didn't lose their inheritance because they made a mistake. They lost their certainty. They lost the assumption that everything would simply be waiting for them. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. They had been planning for my death while I was still living. So I decided to do something they never expected. I started living more. I joined a local book club. I traveled with 2 friends. I learned how to use video calls properly. I planted roses. Finally took the trip to Italy that Robert and I had postponed for 20 years. And every morning, I still stand on my balcony and water the geraniums, the same ones I was watering the morning I found that list. Only now, when I look at my home, I don't wonder who will get it when I'm gone. I wonder what I want to do with it while I'm here. That was the real inheritance I gave myself. The right to stop living as someone else's future. Maybe that is something every parent eventually needs to understand. Your children are allowed to inherit what you choose to leave them, but they are never entitled to own your life before you are finished living it. I spent years believing that being a good mother meant giving everything away. Now I know better. Sometimes being a good mother means setting a boundary so strong that your children finally have to stand on their own. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't taking something away from people. It's simply reminding them that it was never theirs to begin with. 6 months after that dinner, something happened that I never expected. Daniel called me on a Tuesday morning. "Mom?" "Yes?" "Are you busy?" "I was about to make breakfast." "Can I come over?" I looked at the clock. "Of course." He arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a paper bag. "What is that?" "Breakfast." I smiled. "You brought me breakfast?" "Don't sound so surprised." "I am surprised." He laughed. We sat in the kitchen. He looked nervous. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he placed an envelope on the table. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside was a bank statement. I looked at him. "What am I looking at?" "I've paid off the last of my personal debt." I stared at him. "All of it?" "All of it." "How?" He smiled. "Sold the boat." I laughed. "You actually sold it?" Yes, you loved that boat. I loved being able to pretend I could afford things more. I looked at my son. He seemed different, not richer, not more successful, just more honest. I also closed the business account, he said. That was probably wise. I thought about something you said. What? That inheritance isn't a plan. I smiled. Good. He looked down. I used to think you were the person standing between me and the life I wanted. I waited. Then I realized I had never actually built a life of my own. That sentence stayed with me because it was exactly what I had once wanted for him. Not money, not a house, not possessions. Life he could stand behind. He reached across the table. I'm sorry, Mom. This time I squeezed his hand. I know. There was no dramatic hug, no tears, no miracle. Just two people sitting in a kitchen, finally speaking honestly. And somehow that meant more. Sophie came 2 weeks later. She didn't bring groceries. She didn't bring graceberries. She didn't bring paperwork. She didn't ask about the house. She simply sat with me on the balcony. We watched the evening traffic. After a few minutes, she said, Mom? Yes? Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think I'm a terrible person? Turned toward her. No. She looked surprised. I don't. No. I took a breath. I think you made some terrible decisions. She nodded. But there's a difference. She stared at the street below. I've thought about the list a lot. So have I. I hate that I wrote it. I understand. Some cried beautifully. I was sitting with Daniel, and we talked about what would happen eventually. She swallowed. We talked about it like you weren't even there. I didn't interrupt. That is what I'm most ashamed of. I looked at her. Why? Because you were alive. Her voice cracked. I had already Friday started saying, when Mom is gone. I reached for her hand. She held it tightly. I don't want anything from you, she said. I smiled. That is the first time you have ever said those words. She laughed through her tears. I know. We sat there for a long time. Then she asked, What are you going to do with the house? I looked through the balcony doors. Live in it. She smiled. I think that's a good idea. So did I. A year after the list was written, I made one final decision. I wrote both of my children a letter. Not because I was dying. I wasn't. Not because there was some dramatic secret. There wasn't. I simply wanted them to understand something while I was still here to say it. The letter began, My dear Daniel and Sophie, you once divided my belongings while I was still alive. At first, I thought that meant you had stopped loving me. Eventually, I understood something more complicated. You had become so focused on what you might receive that you forgot the person who had spent her entire life giving. I paused after writing that sentence, then continued, I don't want you to spend the rest of your lives feeling guilty. Guilt is easy. Responsibility is harder. So don't remember this as the time your mother changed her will. Remember it as the time you learned that love and entitlement are not the same thing. I will help you when I choose to help you. I will give when I want to give. And I will say no when I need to say no. That doesn't make me a bad mother. It makes me a person. I signed the letter. Then I placed it in 2 envelopes. One for Daniel, one for Sophie. I didn't mail them. I waited until they both came over for dinner. After we ate, I gave them the letters. Daniel opened his immediately. Sophie read hers more slowly. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Daniel looked at me. You're really serious about this, aren't you? About what? Living your own life. Smiled. Very serious. He laughed. Sophie wiped her eyes. I think we forgot you were allowed to. I looked at both of them. Yes, that was our mistake. Yes, but this time the word didn't hurt. It felt like closure. People often ask what happened to the belongings. Truth is surprisingly ordinary. The house stayed mine. The car stayed mine until I decided I no longer wanted it. When I eventually sold it, I bought a smaller car that I actually liked. Robert's watch went to my grandson, just as I had planned. My wedding ring stayed with me. The antique cabinet stayed in the hallway. The piano stayed in the living room. And the savings? I divided them differently than my children had expected. Some went into the grandchildren's accounts. Some went to the charities Robert had supported. Some remained invested. And some I spent. That last part was important. For years, I had saved everything for emergencies, for my children, for the future. Some cried beautifully. Now I had finally understood that the future here was not a place where I would suddenly become allowed to enjoy my own money. The future was made of ordinary Tuesdays, ordinary breakfasts, ordinary trips, ordinary evenings. So I started spending some of it on those things. I went to France with my sister. I bought a ridiculous red coat. I took a cooking class. I had dental work I'd postponed for years. I replaced the washing machine before it completely died. And one afternoon, I bought a painting simply because I loved it. No investment value, no family meaning. I just liked it. When I brought it home, I laughed. It was perhaps the most foolish purchase I had made in years, and it felt wonderful. A few months later, I found the original list again. It had become slightly faded at the edges. I read it one more time. The house, the jewelry, the car, the savings, the furniture, everything they had divided, everything they believed was waiting for them. I folded the paper. Then I put it in the recycling bin. That surprised me. For a long time, I thought keeping the list would remind me never to trust them again. But I didn't need it anymore. I trusted them differently now. Not blindly, not because they were my children, because they had learned that trust has to be earned. That was a much healthier relationship. They still made mistakes. Of course they did, so did I. But now, when Daniel needs help, he asks. When Sophie has a problem, she tells me. And sometimes I help, sometimes I don't. They know the difference, and neither of them assumes that my answer will be Yes, that is perhaps the greatest change of all. I used to believe that a mother's worth was measured by what she could provide: a home, money, support, safety, second chances. Thought saying no meant I was failing them. Now I know that a parent can give a child everything and still fail to teach them how to stand. Sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give is a boundary, a very clear one. My children once sat at a table and divided my belongings while I was still alive. Eyes. I could have spent the rest of my life making them suffer for it. I didn't. I chose something better. I made them responsible for their own lives, and I became responsible for mine. That was my revenge. Not taking their inheritance, not humiliating them, not throwing them out of my life, just refusing to disappear from my own life so they could feel more secure about theirs. Today, when my children visit, they no longer walk through my house looking at what might one day belong to them. They walk through the door and ask, "Mom, how are you?" And I know they mean it. Sometimes we have to lose the version of a relationship we thought we had before we can discover the honest one underneath it. I didn't lose my children. I lost the illusion that loving them meant giving them everything. And once that illusion was gone, something unexpected remained: a mother, 2 grown children, and a relationship finally built on choice instead of expectation. I am 70 now. I'm still alive, still making my own breakfast, still paying my bills, still watering my geraniums every morning. And, as far as I know, no one has written another list. But even if they did, I wouldn't be frightened, because now I know something they once forgot. My belongings are mine. My money is mine. My home is mine. But most importantly, my life is mine, and I intend to keep living it for as long as I possibly can.